Hi. Do you know what a game changer is? It's a moment or an event or even a person who changes the way that things happen from now on. And it happens in such a radical way that things don't go back to the way that they used to be. A simple thing example would be like the forward pass in football. Before the forward pass came into play, people were just running around running into each other and hurting each other pretty bad. But when the forward pass took place in football, it literally changed the way the game would be played. It was a game changer. Along with that, in terms of maybe a more important element or example, would be the Gutenberg press. Gutenberg press came about in 1400s, and it allowed for the mass production of printed material. Before then, everything was written and handwritten, and it was hard to get. It was expensive, but the Gutenberg press allowed for the printing of books and articles and other things, and it became kind of the internet of its day and time. It really changed the way that people were able to get information and be able to share information. So it changed the world. It was a game changer. Along with that is the example of penicillin. Penicillin came about in the late 1920s, early 1930s, where it changed medicine. It changed the treatment of people to where that this antibacterial could really change the way that people responded and reacted in a positive way, medically speaking. And so penicillin was a really big game changer. Along with that, a little bit later on, obviously, you have the introduction of computers and then cell phones, which are basically mini computers that's going on as well. But all these things are outward things that impact our life. They're things that affect the way that we live. But one of the things that we want to look at and that Jesus is speaking about, and as we're looking at Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about the way that we respond to God and the way that we treat one another. And so those are game-changing moments. Jesus changed the way that we interacted with God, and Jesus changes the way that we interact with one another, or that's his desire, is to help us change so that we interact with each other and that we interact with God in a much better way. And so Jesus is our game changer. He's the one that changes us dynamically. Jesus is the one that changes us eternally. And one of the things that we want to look at is that we tend to look at the Bible as individual portions kind of put together, but that's probably not the way that we should. We need to look at the Bible more in terms of the themes and the topic and the content, because God's dealing with a whole bunch of stuff at the same time. And so the Sermon on the Mount, even though it deals with specific areas, the intent there is for it to be part of a larger narrative, of a larger part, of a larger change and transformation of our lives. And in this case, Jesus teaches on the impact of life influence. When we look at what's the end result of the Sermon on the Mount, well, the end result is that God changes us. The end result is that we're not the same. We're different. And we act and we speak and we talk differently, and that we interact with others in a more positive way. Because we are meant to become people of influence, because God has had influence on us and is transforming us. And so it's not just our lives that's impacted or affected, but it's the lives of the people around us, our family, our friends, and those people who are part of our circle of influence as we go through life. And so it's important for us to recognize how much God changes us, how much Jesus changes us. Because don't forget or believe that you don't have influence. Don't ever let anyone say that you don't have influence, because everybody does. And hopefully we're having more and more positive influence on people because of more and more what God is doing in us. It's a process. It's not just a moment or a one-time event, but it's a process of God being at work in us and growing in us. In Matthew 5, and we kind of looked at this a few weeks ago, but in Matthew 5, it says that Jesus is in a setting where he's on a mountainside. People come to him and he sits down and he begins to teach them. And the Beatitudes, the front part of Matthew 5, as you go into the Sermon of the Mount, basically talking about attitudes and behavior. The Beatitudes are all about how God changes us and is desiring to raise the level and expectations in our lives. God changes us, and the way that God has a powerful and positive impact that has on our lives and can have on the lives of those around us. And so God changes the world when he changes our hearts and our perspective. So God changes the world by changing people. God changes the world by not just people, but God changes the world by changing us. And ultimately, God changes the world by changing me. And a better me impacts people, hopefully in a better way. And so if you look at that passage in Matthew 5, he begins at verse 3, and we've talked about this before, so I won't take a long time on this, but he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Again, that's recognizing, being poor in spirit, recognizing that I need God. It's not about finances, it's about recognizing that without God, I'm nothing. And then he goes on and says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." That's mourning over sin, over the fact that I'm broken and I'm not in right standing with God without Jesus. And Jesus is the one who makes my life right with God. And then he goes on to say, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And it goes all the way through. And one of the things that we see in this passage, especially about the Beatitudes, is that all of these speak to attitude, and they all speak to behavior, and they speak to our character. And so Jesus is identifying areas and elements in our lives that he wants to improve, that he wants to make better. And then if you go down to that next portion of the passage in Matthew 5, he talks about that you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. And he begins to raise the level of behavior and expectations of God's people. That we are not to stay here, but we're to step it up. We're to set the example. Why? Because God's at work in us, and he's showing us who we can be and who we should be. And he's encouraging us to press forward and perform at a higher level than a lot of times that we maybe allow ourselves. And so God's at work to challenge us. And so here in this passage about salt and light, Jesus talks about influence that is consistent and influence that is not hidden. There are too many times that we want to step backward and we want to not be up front or talking with someone. But Jesus is talking about how that you are the salt of the earth, and don't lose your saltiness. Don't lose your impact. Because if we're not careful, we can. We can definitely lose whatever positive influence that we can have. And Jesus is warning about that you can be an influencer in your life in a most positive way. In like manner, he says, you are the light of the world, so don't let yourself get hidden. Don't hide that. We as followers of God, we as Christians are meant to share Jesus. Not obnoxiously, not to be that that Christian that everyone warned you about, but we're to be people who are we bring light into the world because God brings light into our life. And we're to be people that are encouragers and people that are helpers. We should be kind and we should be generous and we should be the best that we could possibly be. And so that's what God's bringing to our lives. And so we are salt, we are light. We're not meant to lose our saltiness. We're supposed to maintain that influence in a positive way. We're not meant to be a light that's hidden. And so we should be obvious in all that is good and all that is positive. He goes on in the next part of that Sermon on the Mount, and he talks about the Bible, the fulfillment of the law. And basically he's saying, don't ignore or dismiss what God has said. And we live in a day and an age and a culture that wants to throw out what God has said, to ignore it, to push it off to the sideline and say it's not relevant anymore. Matter of fact, it's filled with hate. Phobic and all that kind of stuff. But Jesus in this passage is talking about don't ignore or dismiss what God has said. And he's talking about the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And he says, in verse 17 of chapter 5, he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And this is an important thing for us to keep in mind, because who are we to think that we can set aside the things that God has said? That is the height of thinking that we're better than God, that we're smarter than God, we're more relevant than God, we're on a different plane than God. And Jesus is saying, I did not come to destroy it. I came to fulfill it. And who are we to think that we can set aside the things that God has said in the Bible? That's an important part for us to wrestle with and deal with. And so Jesus came to explain that, to talk about that, to validate what God has said. And that's life-changing. That's life-impacting. And here's the thing, if we're usually upset with what God has said in the Bible, it's usually because we don't understand what God's trying to get across. Because we know that God loves people, God cares about people, God's not willing that anyone perish, but everyone have eternal life. And so how could a loving God who cares about all these things hate people? Those are some things that we're going to have to wrestle with. So those are some things that we're going to have to kind of come to grips with on how to bring those things together and reconcile those concepts. And that's part of what church is for, part of what the community of faith is for us to not just walk in lockstep, but for us to engage together with one another. And I hope that that's something that you're willing to do, and that we'd love to be able to do that together. And then finally, the passage that we want to look at today, the last part we want to look at today, is this thing where Jesus talks about murder, which is really about attitude and about anger and unresolved issues in our heart and being uncontrolled. And so Jesus is talking in this passage about cause and effect, attitudes and actions. That the things that I embrace inside of me, even though it may seem like everything's calm and still on the outside, but the things I harbor inside of me eventually come out. And in this case, he's talking about how that anger in our lives, or anger in someone's life, can result in the murder, hurt, damage to someone else. And so we need to examine what's going on inside of our hearts and our heads. And the idea too is let God transform the whole person, not just parts. There are times where it seems like as Christians we want to give God bits and pieces of us, but not the whole part. I'm going to hold this portion back. God, you can have all this because that's easy for me to give up, but this other stuff, I'm not going to let you change my attitude. I'm not going to let you change my behavior. I'm not going to let you change this part of my life. And what Jesus invites us to do is to let us come into his presence and come to him and say, here, God, here's who I am. Here's what I have. And to be honest, it's kind of hard to look at the ugly parts of our lives and to let them out. And I mean, it's not like God doesn't know already, but for us sometimes to admit to ourselves that I have major anger issues, I have major issues in other areas, and that I'm broken and I need God's help. Those are hard issues sometimes. But Jesus came to change us, to transform us. And it's not necessarily a one event in a lifetime moment. It's a moment followed by a moment, followed by a moment, followed by a moment, all the days of our life. And isn't that great that God walks with us all the days of our life, loves us the way that we are, does not let us stay there, but challenges us to rise to be better and to be more like him, to reflect his image, because we are literally image bearers is who we are supposed to be. And God is at work in us. And so the idea here is that Jesus changes us for the better, because he is the ultimate game changer and who we are always to go to. Jesus is the one that I go to when I need help, when I need encouragement, when I need direction and guidance. We go to God. Why? Because he changes us and he makes us better. And I just want to encourage you to let God continue to work in your life. A lot of times we kind of get sidetracked because there's a bump in the road, or maybe multiple bumps in the road, and we're just, everything's trashed. But God is the ultimate one who can fix things, and he calls us to him. And I want to encourage you to go to God. Maybe it's been a long time since you've been to God. Maybe it's been a while since you've allowed God into maybe that dark area of your life, or that thing that you don't even want to admit or talk about. But God reaches out to us because he loves us. and He loves you. And He wants to be at work in your heart and in your life too. So allow God to be at work. And then if you want to, you can reach out to us at snohomishfaith.com to connect, or at info@snohomishfaith.com. And again, we'd love to have that conversation with you. We'd love to connect with you somehow, some way, or reconnect possibly with some of you. And so reach out, and we're going to talk some more about how God transforms us and how God changes us. But Jesus is the game changer. And if you need your life to be changed, or continue for your life to be changed, Jesus is the one who reaches out to you. And we'll look forward to talking to you about this a little bit more later on. Take care. Bye.